So, hi everyone. So, welcome to this end of the week kind of afternoon panel discussion by ISDG, the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group. So, we are a multidisciplinary, award-winning, Cambridge-based research network that's been operating in this field since 2019 with the aim of breaking disciplinary silos and creating a platform to discuss various themes emergent in Indigenous studies. So my name is Z. I'm one of the co-conveners of ISDG, and I'm a MPhil researcher in geography department. So my research is broadly on kind of digital transformations and especially kind of use of digital tools in participatory research and the kind of co-design. And today we're really excited to host a panel on refusal-centred Indigenous research ethics and methodologies. And we're very honored to be joined by two brilliant speakers to think together about different framings of refusal in terms of the kind of ethics and politics of doing research with Indigenous communities and broadly in relation to the kind of broader discourse around indigeneity. So here's the format. So each of our speakers are going to do like their, we're going to do their own like talk, and then we're going to gather together and have a conversation. Then we're like open the floor to the Q&A. And we'll start this talk briefly before I introduce our speakers. So first we have Dr. Damien Lee. He's a leading Anishinaabe scholar, associate professor of sociology and Canada Research Chair in Biskaabiiyang and Indigenous political resurgence at Toronto Metropolitan University. And he's just wrapped up his time as a Leverhulme visiting professor with the Treated Spaces research group at the University of Birmingham. And he's a member of Fort William First Nation, a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation, and brings globally recognized expertise in Indigenous political and legal orders, constructions of a citizenship, Indigenous theory, and Indigenous research methodologies, notably the Resurgence strategy known as Biskaabiiyang, an Anishinaabe word meaning returning to ourselves. His works has been published in leading journals like Alternative and the Alberta Law Review, focusing on indigenous governance, wealth, and indigenous inherent citizenship laws. And our second speaker is Professor David Chandler. He's professor of international relations at the University of Westminster. He edits the journal Anthropocene's Human, Inhuman, Posthuman, and convenes both the Materialisms Reading Group and the Black Anthropocene Working Group. And he's published around 30 books, ranging from governing imaginaries of the Anthropocene and digital mapping to critiques of liberal humanitarianism and international interventions. Some of his recent books include Race in the Anthropocene, World as Abyss, Anthropocene Islands, and Becoming Indigenous. So without further ado, let's get started. So Damien, over to you. Thanks.
I'm going to switch mics, so I'm hoping that folks online can continue to hear me, but I'll just, yeah. Okay. I know folks here can hear me, but if there's people online that have lost access, I'm sure they'll start saying something about it. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Just set this up a bit. Slideshow playing. Right. Okay. Does that work? Not really. I'm just gonna restart this. Oh, it's getting worse. Sorry, guys. Do you have a suggestion on what I should do? The mic's not working that great either. Or the mic, there we go. Let's use this. Okay. So yeah, we're here to talk about different aspects of refusal I'm going to give you a little bit about where I'm coming from on this topic, a little bit about me, in addition to what was already shared. In the conversations I was having earlier.
It's use presenter.
Just show.
Yeah, I'll just continue using this. Okay,
Sorry.
but thanks. No, thanks for trying. Okay, so in addition to what was already shared, some of the conversation that we had here today before you all joined us, it became clear that my talk is probably going to come into this space in a really practical sense. I've done a lot of research in Canada that deals with Indigenous governance. Oh, stop sharing online. Sorry, I have to stop. There's a they're not able to see it online.
That should be fine.
Okay. I believe that that's now shared online. Yeah. I think you did it right. I saw the buttons you were pressing. Okay. So I've done a lot of research in the Canadian context with Indigenous communities, and I'm going to bring to this conversation today a couple stories about doing research in this space where refusal really does show up. But I'm also going to contextualize it in this talk in a broader kind of reflection about what does refusal do to the concept of research, and what does it do to administering research, whether from a granting perspective or from a tenure or promotion perspective, the credentialization of research, these kind of messy pieces that I think in some ways what I'm trying to do is flip the lens back onto us as researchers, in addition to thinking about refusal in the space of conducting research in a practical sense. So it's I'm kind of touching on two different things at once here. So just before I go on too much further, I'm just going to talk about some thank yous. So I want to say thank you to the Leverhulme Trust for funding a lot of this research. The entities seen here are really in support of me being here, so I just would like to thank them. Treaty Spaces Research Group at the University of Birmingham, my university, Toronto Metropolitan University of Birmingham proper, and also the Canada Research Chairs Program in Canada. All these entities have really kind of stood behind me with this work over the past few years, so I do say thanks. And of course, also thank you to this group for hosting this talk, and myself and David today. This would not have happened without the leadership and the kind of like invitations that have brought all of us here together today. So thanks for that. So a big thing in Indigenous studies in Canadian context is positionality. And I've already heard a lot about positionality here today in just hanging out and having discussions before this. So I'm going to do the positionality thing because it's really important for my discipline and probably the work that you do as well. So I'm adopted into an Indigenous community when I was a baby. So I'm adopted into Fort William First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe community right on the shore of Lake Superior, kind of in the middle of Canada. I grew up from here to the wall, away from the shore of Lake Superior. Like I'm used to big water, but not big ocean. I'm also a band member of Fort William First Nation. In Canadian legal context, that just means that I'm basically a citizen of the nation. Band membership is a whole kind of special thing that we don't need to get into, but that's in a nutshell what it means. I finished my PhD in 2017. My PhD is in Indigenous Studies from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And as was mentioned, I really do focus primarily on the resurgence of Indigenous political systems and legal systems, specifically citizenship governance, but obviously engaging with a lot with like decolonization and anti-colonialism, etc. So it's a complicated space, but that's kind of in a nutshell where I'm coming from. This is just a map to give you a sense of where I'm coming from physically. That's in the center-ish of Canada. So as I was mentioning, Fort William is an Anishinaabe community, one of 630 First Nations in Canada. Okay, so some thoughts on kind of how to get into refusal-based research, and I'm going to be raising some unfinished thoughts here on purpose. I want to make the space for you to jump in our conversation later. So please do, and I'll be posing some questions as we go. But in my mind and some of the work that I've done, we're thinking about refusal-based research. It really has emerged in a lot of different kind of ways in the Canadian Indigenous studies context about 20 years ago, maybe even further back. But I'll contextualize that a little bit deeper in a moment. But what we can see in some of the emergent research about refusal, we're thinking about research as informing public discourse, and I think that starting point for research that we all do inside the academy is that we do it for the public good. And built into that, I think that there's a little bit of we can critique that a little bit to say, well, is all knowledge accessible into the same degree? Should it be? Under the settler-colonial project, at least in Canada, I would argue North America, Indigenous knowledge has been seen as always accessible. Yes, yep. Has been seen as something that has to be accessed. So just as a little bit of contextualization into settler colonialism, right? Colonialism itself has always needed to know the Indigenous other. It's always been based on knowing the other to justify, that's the belief, to justify extraction, dominance, erasure, or to borrow from Patrick Wolf, elimination. And so when we think about research, right, we can contextualize it in that space. And for our purposes here today, we can put research in the conversation about, is all knowledge mineable? Can we access all knowledge and put it to the use for the public good? I would say that it's much more complicated than I'm giving to you right now. I'm kind of speaking a bit of a binary just to set it up so we can have a conversation. But in essence, we are kind of like, when I think about refusal, we can start to access a mode of thinking about the politics of research in addition to the practicalities of research. That's okay. So there's lots happening. And as we know, like, you're all here doing research. You got your own projects, and you know that it's complicated, and you know that it's political. This is just one more piece of the politics. And so, as I mentioned here, just these kind of latter points here, we can see that it has this history to it of knowing the other when it comes to the kind of like cultural international space in a colonial context, where knowing the other becomes a tool for justifications for dominance later. But in addition to that, what I'm going to kind of bring into this space is there also is, in North America, there is a longstanding but recently resurrected, if I can say it like that, project of being the other. So in a nutshell, the thinking goes that if you can't erase Indigenous peoples in the North American context, you have to become them, right? So this is indigenization. This is pretendianism in the way that we talk about it in Canadian context. And we see this in different aspects of history, such as, the Boston Tea Party, where the Americans that the Americans that threw the tea over into the harbor dressed up as Native Americans, right, to become the other. There's lots and lots happening here. And so when we put research into this space, refusal emerges as a response to colonialism. It also, I would argue, emerges as a deep strategy to preserve nationhood and identity and culture and family. So there's lots going on there, and ideally what we can do here today is kind of get into the nitty-gritty, a little bit more nitty-gritty of these things beyond just the kind of like context. So the key, where I want to bring us is this key question. So all that I've just said, right, and kind of like flipping the lens back onto ourselves as researchers now, how might the academy, and what no one tells you when you're in grad school is that you're also being trained to run the academy someday. Who else is going to run it, right? So us, the people in this room, the academy, the researchers that kind of like govern the academy, its funders, etc., and I think even the public at large, right? How can we better embrace the fact that refusal-engaged research may produce results meant for only Indigenous communities, right? Or whatever a community is practicing refusal. I'm coming from the Indigenous community's standpoint. And as I mentioned, I'm going to kind of like bring in some practicalities with this. So for me, and I'm sure you're aware of this, of these folks, and others have written about refusal as well, but of course, Audra Simpson, Mohawk scholar from Ganawage in Canada-US border, has written about refusal extensively. I first came to her work in probably 2009, but her 2007 piece on refusal, and she engages it with the concept in such a way that really kind of unpacks not only a non-Indigenous to Indigenous research space, but also the insider-outsider research space as well, right? So being Mohawk, doing research on Mohawk citizenship, she also came across refusal in that space when the recorder was on. Right? You're doing interviews. Maybe less known, but very important to our conversation today is David Garneau. David Garneau is a Métis artist scholar, University of Regina in Canada. I'll bring in some of his work here in a few moments, but he introduces some really useful frameworks to allow us to think about navigating this space of refusal, of research, of academic work generally, in ways that maybe gives us some language at least, gives us some language to understand the spaces between cultures as research is happening. I'll say it like that now and come back to him in a moment. So just really briefly, talking about Simpson's work, she relays stories. She relays stories about, interviewing people, sitting down, having conversations, doing transcripts, and coming across limits, right? So she comes across limits of what's able to be said and what she's even allowed to ask. Right? And so she narrates refusal as this kind of concept where it's the line where researchers are told to stop. Right? I'm just paraphrasing her here in those top 2 bullet points. Right? So there's limits on what can be asked. Right? And I'm not going to read this full quote for you, but she's talking about, at one point in this piece, 2007 piece, she's talking about how it's not only her as researcher, it's also her as Mohawk citizen, right? And so the underlying piece here, so she's asking things like, can I do this and still come home? Can I do this kind of research and still be a part of my nation, my community? What am I revealing here and why? Where will this get us? It's a critical question. But also, who benefits from this and why? So you can see that the politics are at play here in terms of research as the project at hand. This is not news, I'm sure. This is just set up to make sure that we're on the same page in the sense of like when communities do refuse, it's not only a refusal from those from outside, right? They may be refusing research in and of itself, which I think raises important questions that I hope to get into here. David Garneau does something a little bit different, but I think related to this work. So I really only bring in a couple key ideas of his here, just for the sake of time. But he wrote this really, really important piece, imaginary spaces of reconciliation and ill reconciliation. Basically, he's coming, let me just set this up for you. He's coming at the conversation from the perspective of an artist, a curator, and he's talking about how Indigenous communities in Canada can share art in a safe way. Safety is really important here because if we think about colonialism, not simply as an economic project, as a project of political and legal domination, and of course extraction, but if we also think about it as a cannibal, this comes from Indigenous thought. The cannibal does a couple different things. It eats everything in front of it. But more importantly, it will not stop. Its appetite is insatiable. It will eat and eat and eat until it explodes. So that is really critical when we're thinking about refusal and Indigenous knowledge, and in Garneau's case, art, because overtures in the colonial project, overtures such as like, let's get along, or let me share knowledge with you in the hope that we're going to be able to renew our relationship in a good way to be less violent. I think that ultimately is probably a mistake. I think that Garneau would agree here in the sense that if settler colonial societies such as Canada is understood to be a type of cannibal, it will only eat what's put in front of it. It cannot be trusted. Right? And so just to drill this down for Garneau, Garneau is basically saying we need different spaces. Indigenous peoples need research. They produce art, they produce language that is really, that's not only for them, but is also acts upon the world, is useful. It does things in the world. It takes advantage of opportunities. It meets new challenges. But then you run into a bit of a paradox. Paradox is, if these knowledges are useful for Indigenous communities, yet Indigenous communities are surrounded constantly by the colonial project, how then do you protect it? So this is where refusal comes in. And what Garneau says is, at that second point there, he introduces this topic of the sovereign display territory. I won't spend too much time on this other than to say it's the space that is controlled by Indigenous peoples between themselves and the settler colony in order to project an image to have a relationship. But really, really critical to this, the first point, he also imagines a space of irreconcilable Aboriginality, which basically means this is where the knowledge lives. The knowledge lives inside this space that's only for Indigenous folks. And then it is shared in certain ways that are safe to have the relationship with others. And I'll give you an example. So you may have heard of a moccasin, like this is a shoe that many Indigenous peoples make in North America. And there's like beading on it, and there's certain stitches, and every nation has its own version of this. And a good example of what we're talking about here with Garneau is that the stitching, the style, the beadings, the beading pattern, these are not just physical objects. Right? This is a knowledge system, and it's also a political system. In order to stitch in the right way, in order to make the right pattern, and rightness is really just a reflection of being congruent with the knowledge system. It's not about authenticity, it's about what is congruent with the knowledge system. In order to do all that, you need to have relationships, right? You need to have relationships with the hunters. You need to have relationships with the experts, the older people who know how to do these things, and they need to trust you. And so there needs to be a politic of relationality there. And where this kind of comes into play for our conversation is that I think Garneau would say to hand over that knowledge to the settler society is very risky, because you're handing over the knowledge system, you're handing over the goods, you're handing over the pearls, right? And so what he would say, and others have said, is that in that space of the sovereign display territory, the space in between, you make a distorted version of it, one that really kind of means it's like gibberish, right? There's no encoded knowledge in this. It's just a kind of distortion, or a mimic. So practically what I'm saying here is like the moccasin that maybe is sold or shared in that space looks like a moccasin, looks like a shoe, but there's no knowledge encoded into it. Right? The beating pattern doesn't mean anything other than, for sale or whatever. So this comes into our conversation here today about refusal, in the sense that whereas Simpson is talking about there are these boundaries where knowledge is ultimately not shared, right? She talks about how recorders are turned off at certain times, then different conversations happen. This is kind of something similar to what Garneau is saying, in the sense that there is knowledge at play inside Indigenous communities and thought networks that maybe never will be shared outside of that space. So then as researchers, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for you, right? Again, this is like questions I'm trying to like open up for later. So I'm just gonna, I'm probably, I'm not gonna go on too long here, but I'm gonna do a couple more things before I wrap up. I'm gonna share a story with you about some of the practical research that I've done, where refusal shows up. I'm gonna try to weave some of these points into it, and then hopefully we can unpack later. But in a nutshell, I'm going to draw on one specific example. So about 3 years ago, I was doing research with a community that had invited me to do research with them. They're not my own community. It's another Anishinaabe or Ojibwe community in Ontario, in Canada. And I had no connection with them, but we basically formed a working relationship. And it was a really kind of on-point experience for our purposes today. They were interested in some work that they wanted done for themselves. It was really anti-colonial. I can't tell you the specifics of it because you'll see in a moment, because they refused certain elements of this. But what I can say, it was really important to them. It's also in line with the stuff that I like to do. And it has really profound long-term implications, not only for that community, but also other communities around them. And so when we were establishing the working relationship, they were also like, yeah, we want to do this project. So we raised all this money. And they said, but we don't want you to publish anything for this, right? They're kind of saying like, this is a boundary. We're refusing our knowledge to leave the community. And we want to have control over it. And so the way that, Garneau is thinking about these things, and Simpson may be thinking about these things, is there are these different lines around the community that they have drawn for themselves, while at the same time recognizing that they need research to be done. Right? This isn't just for my benefit or my university's benefit. They saw a need that needed to be filled by partnering with me and my team, and I guess my university legally. That's the legal relationship. And so they would not start the project until a research agreement is in place. And in Canada, research agreements are legal contracts, right? It's a contract between the First Nation and the university that I'm operationalizing. And it was really clear, like they don't want any of their data being used outside the community. So I wasn't allowed to publish anything, right? They said, if you did want to publish anything, you would have to get our permission in writing, right? So, and I was like, actually, this is really cool. Like, I don't want to ask for your permission in writing. This is a really cool thing that's happening with you guys owning this. So let's do it. And they said, like, you can talk about, process. So stuff like this I'm doing here today is a process thing. I could write about process if I want without permission, but, just really ultimately, I'm still thinking through some of the kind of intricacies of this. And so in the end, what happens is that the community does this work, there's no publications coming out of it, etc. Right? And they continue to do the work today. But why this is interesting for us is that when we're thinking about refusal as practitioners in the academy, right, as researchers, it does raise some things that become important for you, for me, for the academy, and for Indigenous communities. When a community says, we want to do work with you, but we don't want you to use the data, right? So there's an entire like academic industrial complex happening here. There's not just us. We're all, as students, you pay to be here, right? At my university, I get paid to teach there. There's all these grants. There's ethics boards you got to pass to do research. There's a very serious machinery in place to make this stuff work that we're talking about here. And it's all very political, of course, but it's all play. There's three things that I think happen, but I'm just going to focus on the first one here, tenure promotion. When we do bump up against these refusals in academic spaces, it raises things about, well, how are institutions responding to refusal, right? What are institutions thinking about navigating this in relation to community and to you and to me, right? So tenure promotion is a big one. Granting, so at least in the Canadian context, when you get a federal research grant, the expectation is that knowledge is going to become public. Right? So how do I take the federal dollars that I receive for this project and then not use it publicly? It's a conversation with the funder to say, like, actually, you can't have it. And then also there's a little bit in here about the concept of research itself, just in the sense of, if research is supposed to be for the public good and for data dissemination, what happens then to the concept? But I'm just going to focus, just for the sake of time, on tenure promotion. So just really briefly then, right, in the Canadian context, I'm sure this is happening elsewhere, there are responses being put into place that are trying to embrace or kind of see or engage with Indigenous research, Indigenous communities in ways that do less violence, ideally no violence, but let's be honest, we're not there yet. And so some examples exist, such as there are graduate theses and dissertations being written in Indigenous languages in Canada right now. So, in order to do that, you not only have to have the language speaker doing the writing, but also the language speakers from community assessing the validity of the project, right? So if you can't understand what's being written or said, how can you assess that? So there's space being made for this. There's also space being made for Indigenous knowledge holders on committees. So outside of the language thing I just talked about, like Indigenous elders are, in some cases, coming onto committees to adjudicate a dissertation, a PhD, a master's degree. That especially when that project deals with their own community, their own nation, whether or not the person is Indigenous doing the research. And it's also an increasing value being put on in community engaged research or in community driven research. But there's also some elements at play here that continue to need to be challenged. So this is where I'm going to come into a conclusion here, a minute or two, but ultimately it raises really important questions about how do we think about getting a degree? How do we think about getting a professorship or getting tenure, permanent position, when refusal is at play? Really critical to this, at least in my experience where I come from, is that often when you go up for tenure, right, you're becoming a professor, you are assessed based on kind of metrics, like how do people outside your discipline assess you to determine whether or not you're going to be a professor? And there's this like emphasis on numbers, right? It's like number of publications, number of partnerships, and ultimately, how, without going into deep detail on the kind of publications that you're doing, how is your work being assessed? This is not an argument just for against quantitative metrics, but it's an argument against thinking about the value of relationship and the importance of having good relationships in research. When we see refusal at play, I would argue that the metric is not necessarily the number of partnerships you have with the Indigenous community or the number of publications you have coming out of research with Indigenous communities, I would argue the metric is whether you're being invited back to do the work, right? Because refusal is also about not inviting you back, right? And I think that if research is being done in such ways that upholds Indigenous research ethics, Indigenous methodologies, and those goals, even when refusal is at the center of a project or a center of a relationship, that creates the preconditions as to whether that initial invitation is extended again, which then has a different implication that sometimes comes up at degree granting tables or tenure granting tables of, well, why does this person have so little published? They've been working with this, I'll just make this up. They've been working with this community for 10 years and they only have like 2 publications. Like, that's not a great record. The shift here, what I think refusal does for us in kind of thinking about the politics of Indigenous research is that if there is a way to assess for that continued relationship, the 10 years is actually very significant. It's not 6 months, it's not 10 months. It's actually a very long time in kind of like a career-based sense. So I might just park it there, making space for David, but just to wrap up really quickly, like some questions I hope we get into here today is like, how do we think about research informed by refusal in the space of like, what is research's kind of role in informing the public good? Okay. I'll maybe just leave it there and hopefully we can have a good talk. Thanks for that. Thanks for listening to me. Hopefully we unpack further. David, why not?
So I'll just say something very briefly. Come up. Thanks, Damien, for that really kind of insightful talk on the kind of internal politics of academia. So now we're going to take a little bit of a philosophical, theoretical turn. So for David's talk.
No, I think research in the public good. I can use Damien's PowerPoint.
Okay.
Is this not? I'm not going to use Damien's whole.
Let's put it there.
Politics. So thank you. It's really nice to be here and nice to see so many people. And what I'm going to try, I think the time is limited. But anyway, I think I might talk for less time than Damien. And hopefully I'll have less technical issues because we sorted them all out in the first part of it. So I guess my view of Indigenous refusal is really the way that Indigenous refusal is understood and appropriated within the Western canon, Western policymaking. So bearing in mind that set of like traveling understandings of Indigenous refusal may have various ways of working, and many of those have no relationship at all to an Indigenous understanding of Indigenous refusal. However, maybe the starting point might be, if we were to think what is Indigenous refusal, I think it's a refusal of an understanding of research or knowledge being available as some sort of public good. What does that mean? It means that an Indigenous refusal is understood to understand entities in their relations. It's understood as an understanding that says context and relations need to be put at the forefront rather than metrics and counting and an assumption of universalizability. So even the idea of Indigenous knowledge already begins to set some warning signs that this is already a Western understanding, because knowledge is something that can be universalized, that can be taken out of a context, put in its box somewhere else. Now, what I think is that increasingly the Western Academy and Western policymakers are open to that understanding of refusal. They're open to an understanding of the importance of relationality, and they're wary or they're problematized by what that means for certain things that Western modes of governing, Western modes of thinking hold quite dear. Things as basic as time and space, subject, causality, everything is brought into question once we begin to open up some essential modernist assumptions. So, and I think that that has a great relationship to the understanding of Indigenous refusal, because I think we could understand that the Western subject as a rational, autonomous subject is understood as a subject where research is always going to be for the public good, where knowledge is always universalizable, where the subject is cut apart from a world where the subject has the agency and the knowledge and the capacities, and the world is there before it to be known, to be instrumentalized, and to be used. We understand the historical, social, political construction of that subject through the violence of coloniality, of indigenous dispossession, of chattel slavery, a process of hundreds of years of violence that it took to create this, what we would now see as a problematic and artificial construction of a subject and a world which depended upon the violence and the dispossession and the discrediting of other ways of knowing. These other ways of knowing in the development of coloniality were understood to be problematic precisely for their failure to understand knowledge as separable from the relations and the environment and the context. Precisely the things that we're beginning to value as a Western academy and Western policymakers in our time of the Anthropocene, of climate change, of the crisis of modernity, the problematic nature of whiteness, whatever it is you might want to see, the problems of the world today. There's a certain openness to what we may understand as Indigenous refusal. So in my short sort of presentation, I want to think about the problematic nature of that reappropriation of indigeneity within a different contextual understanding of what it means to be a subject and how it is that we engage with the world. And so I've been working in this sort of area for a while. One framework of sort of neoliberalism I want to sort of not really focus upon, but I want to so I'm not going to focus on it because time is short, and you can read what I've written about it. So I think the three key areas where Indigenous refusal is used as a saving mechanism are connected with the uncertainties and the crises of the moment. The first one we might call the crisis of climate change, or a more empirical understanding of the Anthropocene. Practical, policy-orientated, emergency need to think about Indigenous refusal and what it might mean for us or for settler colonialism in a world that appears to be in crisis. And then I sort of want to think more problematically, maybe, what Indigenous refusal might do for our academic disciplines that depended very much on the cuts and the separations of modernity. And then thirdly, if there's time, what it might do for whiteness and the desire to escape whiteness, whatever that might mean. So that's a few like sort of complicated sort of problematics already. So I'm going to try and be as clear as I can be. So Indigenous refusal and climate change. I think we can, I'm not saying I think it's broadly accepted by the IPCC, people engaged in the climate crisis, that the climate crisis tells us there's a problem with the science and the knowledge and the ways of doing of modernity, that the things that we thought were big and clever for hundreds of years, civilizing, developing, all the rest of it, seemingly behind our backs, as they say, the externalities, the side effects, the unintended consequences, the things we hadn't calculated in our modes of knowing and of valuing mean that while we thought we were doing so much better, the world was being destroyed while we were celebrating how brilliant we were. The way of understanding the problematic nature of that is that modernity and the cut between the human and the world isn't as clever as we thought it was, because in making those cuts and those abstractions and those assumptions that research and knowledge was always universal, always for the public good, we realized that we weren't thinking about relationships. We were just having metrics of amounts of things produced, how much profits were made, because there was an assumption that the human could understand and control and direct, and that the world was before us to be instrumentalized. There was a liberal telos of time and space that said whatever the problems might be, no matter the deaths, the dispossessions, the crisis of the environment, there's always going to be lessons learned, there's always going to be a future, it's always going to be brighter and better. In our contemporary moment, we feel that that was like too hubristic, that this human-centered stuff and this so-called sciencey thing that depended on the world always being available, always being the same, those abstractions may have, for some people, may have been useful at some point, but now they failed to serve their purpose. We need to think differently. We need to involve other ways of thinking and doing, and therefore indigenous refusal, understood as the need to be skeptical of universal understandings, is much more to the fore. The idea that just because one thing might work in one place, it doesn't mean it's going to work forever. The more we put fertilizers in order to encourage productivity, even in that one space, there's going to be limitations, let alone when we think that land is universal and climate's universal, or the ways that water flow might be universal. All of those engineering and technological ways of engaging and problem solving become problematic. I think there's a little debate about climate change and indigenous refusal and relational contextual understandings. Maybe more important might be thinking about the problem of modernity in a broader sense, in a way which we might say is brought on by climate change and the need to rethink things that we thought about modernity as progress, as development. But in our disciplines, social sciences and natural sciences, the importance of decentering the human, I think, is really there. And I think it's especially been there in terms of the problems of policy making and the assumptions of research and the public good and universality. That our experiences, maybe I do international relations, don't shoot me now, but in the world of international relations, over the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, where there was no thinking about objectively intervening in the world because the world was politically divided, people just gave money for development to whether they supported the Russians or the Americans. There was no real objective view of how do we do development, or how do we do democracy, or how do we do peace. However, in the last 30 years or so, there's been an imaginary that we can develop research on development, security, democracy, peace. We can just take these brilliant ideas and these brilliant policies and transfer them to the world and problem solve. The experience, in terms of the way it's understood by the World Bank, the IMF, and policymakers, is actually differences do make differences. Relations are important, but just because an entity looks good or strong one day in relation to one thing doesn't mean that it's going to be the same in relation to another thing. So I'm pretty sure you folks are engaged in some real world policy stuff. It's very difficult for policymakers, the more they become aware of the importance of indigenous refusal and of relationality, to engage with that. So you might be somewhere, one village looks like another village, but that doesn't mean they're going to respond in the same way to a particular crisis of conflict or famine or illness. The focus of policymakers is very much, how do we get away from this understanding that what purely looking at an entity gives us a clue to anything. So I think that's just one example, that a broader modernist crisis that is challenging an idea of linear causality. So when they talk about sort of a non-linear understanding, what they're saying is that we may think this is the solution, and it may have worked here or at a particular time, but because communities are different, because societies are different, we need to have a relational understanding. We can't just take knowledge, which is relationally determined, and pretend that it's just some pure abstraction. I don't think this is rocket science. So I think the more important thing is the third attraction of Indigenous refusal. And I sort of intimated that that was an attraction for whiteness. Well, time is limited, so I'm just going to assume that we're all on the sort of the same page. Why could Indigenous refusal be attractive for whiteness? I think in our contemporary moment, in our contemporary world, our subjectivities are very attuned to the fact that Eurocentric whiteness, civilization, all the things that were acclaimed as so positive are tainted. They're tainted all the way down. They're tainted in terms of a relationship to race and discrimination and to gender, to sexuality, and they're tainted in terms of the relationship to the environment and the world. How do we remove that baggage is what whiteness or Eurocentric thought might think. How can we act in the world with that baggage? And the more you think about that baggage and the more that we're attuned to the problematic nature of it, the more difficult it is to act in the world. What credibility could you have to say to other countries or communities or whatever how to do anything? You know, okay, you might have more money or something, but even the idea that you have more knowledge or anything is discredited, and particularly the idea that you have more moral worth. That's also discredited. However, Indigenous refusal is a fundamental value to whiteness. Why is that? Because in a white appropriation of Indigenous refusal, the past doesn't matter, because we're always already in the present. We're governed not by our intentionality and our plans and our hubristic intentions. We're governed by our sensitivity to the relations that we're embedded in. We're governed by an empirical agenda that the world sets us. So in thinking about relationality, in thinking about becoming in entangled, future-orientated ways, the attention is not to a baggage of the past. The attention is always to the openness of the now. And in that refusal of linear historical legacies, in that refusal of like the broader contextual frameworks of understanding, in the imaginary that we can just throw off 300, 500 years of coloniality and domination and destruction, Indigenous refusal really speaks to a certain subjectivity. So the desire to become Indigenous is not just a pretendian, although we understand where the pretendian aspects come from. We understand that the white fantasy of becoming Indigenous is a fantasy of becoming pure, a fantasy of getting rid of guilt. However, the refusal of the imagination of Indigenous refusal is really what we need. There needs to be a calling to account. There needs to be a sort of critical approach to a white desire to just start again in a pure way. I think that accounting has to be an important thing to take into account. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
So thank you to David, who gave us a kind of refusal.
Can they still sit here?
Just whatever you
I mean, the people online, can they hear us? Not near a microphone.
we can load it with that. Oh, yeah, I think we have another one.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know the technical stuff is not my concern. Let's just get in our board heads. We need to.
Hello?
Yeah.
Thank you. Over to Z, Sharon.
This is for you to talk. I'm just needing through. You guys are doing most of the talk.
I think it's the audience's turn.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on where you're coming from, what brought you into the space, and where we can engage in the conversation.
Okay.
And there seems to be some comments on the.
Oh, and there's some comments too.
Are you please, someone please sing that online?
Yeah, we can like alternating between the online and offline comments. So yeah, I think we'll just enter the kind of Q&A session. If any of you have any questions for our speakers, please raise your hands. Or we can just start with the online questions. Yeah, we'll start with this.
Oh, on the microphone. Okay. Okay, thank you very much both for sharing. So I'm also from Canada. And for me, being from Canada means a relationship with the land. So I have a close relationship with a lot of trees. I want to share a little story as like the intro for my thought here, my curiosity, which is that one time I was walking in, I don't want to say where, but I was walking in Canada. And I came across some trees and I was really excited. They were beautiful, huge, amazing trees. And I thought, oh, I want to take a photo of these so I can share with my wife these beautiful trees I've seen. And they were like, no photographs, please. And they were like really clear about the fact that their presence in that space is meant to not be shared. And I have a lot of beliefs around the way the trees hold knowledge and the way that they communicate with the land around them. And I understood it as their presence there needs to be protected because if people know that they're there, then they'll start to mine that knowledge of those trees in a way that they're meant to just sort of, they're there to hold that knowledge at that time. So it had me thinking, because you were mentioning, Damien, about the public good, that is there value in like reframing what the public is? And in my case, it would be that the earth has knowledge that it's trying to hold on to. And that's who I'm serving in that space by accepting that refusal.
Sorry, and not to be too formal, but I'm just trying to be conscious of the people online who can't hear us without the mic. That's why I'm so worried about the mics. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we heard between the two of our talks, and just there's some of it in that comment question, is that there's actually two things I'd like just to give back and welcome David and likes. I think that one thing is there is, as you say, a reframing kind of politic at play here. Like we show up in the academy and we show up in research, having grown up in a certain context that just informs our perspective. If that's a boring thing, but that's the reality. And I think part of what we're doing here in this kind of conversation, generally here and elsewhere, is like reformulating what we're talking about in terms of research. It's kind of what I was saying earlier about refusal also challenges the definition of research in some ways because of the public good, and you're coming at it from a different way. I think that aside from answering the question, I think for me a really productive thing is identifying the things that can be rethought. Public could be one of those things. Research can be one of those things in my mind. While at the same time not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because we are here because we believe in the work that we do. Like this is why you're spending all this time sitting here today and paying the money you're paying and doing the work that you're doing in the academy. But how can we do it better? And I think that part of that is making space for reformulations when we need to, whether it be public or whatever the case may be. So that's the first thing. The other thing I think is important is that when we're thinking about that knowledge, and something that's come up between the two of our talks here today, is that Indigenous knowledges are so contextual, so ultra contextual, to the point that some Indigenous theorists say that knowledge is relationship. And David put it well earlier, and I think that this is one of the places where refusal really does show itself, is that it's really difficult, and I would say probably unethical, to take local knowledges and extract and use them and kind of apply them as if they are just going to simply fit elsewhere. And a good example of that is, certain ways of hunting or gathering in, say, Southern Ontario, and then using the knowledges and the political systems and even the legal systems that come from understanding how to do that in a good way over hundreds of years. And then taking those approaches and then applying them in, say, the Arctic, right? The knowledge and the law and the politics that comes with understanding how to gather, say, I'll just say wild rice, and then taking those and applying them to hunting whales probably is going to do damage to the legal system in the north, because they're not interchangeable. And I think this is what you're getting at earlier. But that's some thoughts I'll get back to you there.
You sort of might say that the Earth doesn't have knowledge or not have knowledge because knowledge is a relation, in the same way that a book, everyone could read the same book, but the knowledge isn't in the book, and it's not in the person, it's in the relation between the person and the book. And even if you read the same book later on, it would be a different relation, and then the knowledge would be different. So what I'm thinking is that a Western drawing upon Indigenous refusal seems to speak to us in a way in which it didn't speak to us before. And if you think of it like that, that challenges all of our knowledge practices. Like even a university is based on a book having its knowledge inside it, or going to a lecture is based on the idea that everyone gets the same thing from a lecture, rather than understanding the importance of relations. And I think that, like it or not, relationality is coming. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was really insightful conversation, and I really appreciated the different degrees of refusal. So my background is in environmental science, and so I've done a lot of conservation work, environmental justice work. I worked in the US and also the Pacific Northwest, so really thinking British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. And some of the work that comes up in the discourse that I've done has been around the white sea. So really thinking about the context that David Chandler and others from the University of British Columbia have experienced regarding conservation practices, both blending Western science and Indigenous knowledge into practice of conservation. And I'm curious to get your thoughts contextualizing both of those worlds and what does that mean for conservationists.
You want to take a few questions?
Being like,
Sure. If there isn't any other questions, then yeah, one at a time is a great idea.
Okay. Can you hear? Okay, good. Yeah, good question. So two-eyed seeing, I'm not sure how much people know about that as a framework, but it's something that's coming. It's quite prevalent in North America, especially Canada, especially in the environmental sector, and elsewhere. But in a nutshell, it basically is a way of saying that Indigenous knowledges and Western knowledges are equal, and that you can use both with one in each eye, right, to solve problems. I think that's in a nutshell. It's safe to say, and I think politically it makes sense. I'm really critical of two-eyed seeing. I actually think it's a bit of a problem. The problem I have with it is that Indigenous knowledge is already valid unto itself. Like, we have to start there. If we're not starting there, then we have a problem, I would say. Then we're reproducing colonialism right at the very first step, right? And so my concern with two-eyed seeing is that maybe it's practical application, but definitely in its worst case scenario, it requires the approval of the Eurocentric positionality to then validate the Indigenous knowledge. I think that just forecloses decolonization in my mind. It may produce partnership and may open a door for critical partnership, even to go further down the path and maybe even solve some problems. So I'm coming at this from a really political place. I would argue that Indigenous knowledges, whoever's nation's knowledges are at the table, don't need to be validated from elsewhere, step one. And I would argue, going further, that what we actually need is a politics of deference as opposed to a politics of mutuality. I think that if Indigenous knowledges are valid, in the same way that Western knowledges are valid, it's like, I'm not saying that Western knowledge is, it's not binary, right? This is not Western knowledge is bad. But if we are saying that Indigenous knowledges are valid unto themselves and can learn from and engage with other knowledges, if we're bringing decolonization into that space, then I think there's also a requirement for us to talk about what does it mean to defer to Indigenous communities who sometimes the knowledges aren't interpreted or cannot be interpreted by the Eurocentric lens. And that's okay, right? So it's a politics of deference, I think, that needs to be present that really isn't often.
So I don't know about 2IC, but I'm familiar with W.B. Du Bois and discussions of like double consciousness and the idea that we can have a certain way of seeing. I don't like using knowledge because that's obviously problematizes the equality, but the idea that we can have a way of seeing from behind the veil and within the veil, and the idea that they could somehow be equal is problematic, because the whole point is that if you're trapped within a white world of the veil, your ability to see the world is entirely limited. And therefore, double consciousness isn't just another way of seeing the same world. It entirely problematizes sort of the veil that exists and problematizes that dominant hegemonic way of seeing. And to my mind, Indigenous knowledge is not knowledge, it's an approach, a relational approach, which can't just be added to the Western set of knowledge understandings. It entirely destroys and problematizes a sort of linear causality, a world of essences and deadness. So I'm not really at all on the board of like some multiply all these forms of knowledge. That's just an appropriative move as far as I can see.
And just while we're passing the mic, I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Eva Jewell. She is Anishinaabe, Dr. Eva Jewell at my university, Toronto Metropolitan. She's written a little bit critically about this. So if you look up just how it sounds, Eva Jewell, her dissertation, there's some citable stuff in there that challenges tuatsin.
We put the name in your chat. So I just have like a very quick follow-up question on the 2IC. I'll wait for you to do that.
Okay, I'll listen.
Caroline. So when I was doing the kind of literature review about the kind of genuine participatory research with Indigenous communities, obviously it's kind of like a recurring concept, like 2IC. And you were talking about the kind of, which I absolutely agree, there's no kind of, it's not like Indigenous knowledges need Western validation. But when I was reading the kind of, I can't remember the name of this scholar, but the one that initially put forward this concept, I think from my reading, he was not really using the term like validating. He was more talking about this like happy, holly jolly, we're open, like all forms of systems of knowledge open to each other, learn from each other, that kind of sense. So is it just different kinds of framing or interpretation of the concept? Or I just kind of want to push on this concept a little bit, and then we'll go to the question in the chat.
Yeah.
Greece.
I think it's
Yeah. Greece.
okay. Yeah, that's that. I mean, I think you're right. Like, I think that it's not always. I think there's been an evolution about this term that I think. Who are the power holders, right? I mean, the power holders tend to be non-Indigenous peoples, at least in the Canadian context, who are governing research. There are Indigenous peoples who are doing that, of course, like governing research, but there is if we think about what pretendianism does, and kind of like settler move to innocence, to like borrow from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, like these moves to innocence, there is a kind of like turning the volume down on guilt, right? Like how can I just not change and still do the thing, so I can still be in control of the narrative or in control of research. My cynical perspective on this is that two-eyed seeing may have been bastardized to do that, to like feed into as a tool of turning the guilt down on like, well, I mean, do I have a role in this space? Maybe my role might be challenged, but if I engage this, if I use this framework, then I can still then validate Indigenous knowledge again. It's like a reproduction thing. But this, me being really cynical, and I would actually be really interested to hear what our colleague at the back who asked that question, what your thoughts are on this piece of like, has there been a bastardization? Is it black and white? Like, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I certainly.
Yeah, sorry.
Just quick, I think you answer.
Microphone.
No, I just quickly comment.
It's kind of an engagement. So, but it's an open conversation, right? So I think things are way more complex and binary.
Yeah.
There are no sort of black and white narratives, but it has become more of a buzzword, right? So I think holding clear the intentionality of how words are held and what kind of positionality we hold is super important. And so, I worked in conservation, and I worked in a really dominant organization that was trying to dismantle old practices, but did it continue to perpetuate the same issues? Absolutely, I think. But I feel like there is space for that accountability and that kind of criticism to continue to be spoken and shared. I also think things like decolonization, in the US, like that's really common to hear that term, and it's become such a, again, like overgeneralized word, and trying to decipher what that actually means for different communities, because colonial powers were so different, and not only in the US and Canada, and all throughout the world. And so words carry a lot of weight. And so I think we just have to be mindful of that. So I was just really curious to get that critical perspective. Thank you.
Sure.
Question there.
Yeah, we do one online. I think they're waiting. We'll do one online question and then we'll come back to the questions. So we have an online question from Caroline saying, "Hi, thanks so much for these brilliant talks. I have a question for Damien. What exactly is a motivation for Indigenous refusal? Is it strictly a protection from abuse or cooptation, or eating up of indigenous knowing, or is it indirectly meant as a political message to dominant knowledge production and politics, desiring to convey a critique of the structural and modernist or epistemological violence of these hegemonic structures?"
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's all of that. I think it's all of it. I think it can just be a pushback. Like sometimes you just need to push back. But I think that there's also a political, sort of like a research politic at play there. I'll just talk about that one because I think that's the more interesting one for a room full of researchers. But I think there is just a thing about pushing back. So I'm gonna deepen this a little bit in the sense that Indigenous nations have responded to colonialism as a matter of survival and as a matter of nation building through treaties, for example, as well. It's not black and white. However, colonialism has very clearly been violent, right? Politically and physically, and in gendered ways as well. And Indigenous nations have long histories of navigating political change that even predate the colonial order. And I would argue that refusal may have a name that is temporally situated for really important reasons in the way that Simpson and others have written about it, because it is really refined in a way that we understand and use it right now. But I would argue that refusal is part of a deeper political system that has long hid knowledge in ways that becomes accessible later when it's safe to do so again. I don't have time to get into it here, but basically there are many stories of knowledges being disassembled into component parts so they don't look like a complete knowledge system to avoid colonial detection, right? There's stories of knowledge, pieces of knowledge being hidden in the ground physically and metaphorically. There's stories of knowledge being hidden in songs and dances as a way to avoid detection. And so refusal doesn't come out of just a response to colonialism, I would argue. I would argue it's an extension of an existing deeper political system that has managed threats in the past. And in that sense, the question here, in the context of research, what's going on with refusal? Is it just pushing back, or is it about, protecting that knowledge? I've already said it's both, but I think in terms of research, I think it's a continuation of managing knowledge in a way that benefits and prioritizes, like really explicitly prioritizing one's own nation, one's own knowledge system. And then if there's space, and then if it's safe, and if there's need to share in the way that maybe David Garneau's kind of gestures towards with this like in-between space, then that's another conversation to have. But just to address the question, I think there's a deeper way. I think there's a deep way to kind of like situate these things that even decenters colonialism as the impetus for refusal. I think it has a deeper history.
I imagine that Indigenous refusal is just as flexible and adaptive as coloniality. And I guess that in our contemporary moment, Indigenous refusal can speak to many sort of challenges to a settler state understanding of the political and education, of loads of assimilative and integrative policies that it actually makes more sense, and the more that we become in a relational world, the more powerful those arguments will be. So I think there's a certain pragmatism as well. There's always been, that's relationality is pragmatic.
Yes. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting about presentations. So I come from a STS tradition, and it's really interesting that there has been parallel discussion on how knowledge cannot be transferred without its attachments, and it cannot be even meaningful without transferring its attachments. And I think there are similar discussions in STS too. But what I wanted to ask the two of you was on the notion of public good, and if this notion, as far as I know, this notion comes from economics, and if you think that this notion can be defended in any way. Because it was also like opposed in STS2 in science studies as saying that like how it was part of some particular political agenda to say that science is a public good. But what do you think about the idea, not particularly in indigenous communities, but like the idea of science as public good? And if we can redefine, as one of the participants also asked, if we could redefine it. Thank you.
That sounds to me quite philosophical. Would you like to start?
Only if you give me the microphone.
Yeah.
So, so as you say, STS, Access Network approaches material semiotics as a whole range of work. And I guess the understanding of the public would not be a sort of liberal, democratic, formal one, but would be a pragmatic, practical problem orientated one, like Don Dewey's Public and Its Problems, a problem in the public have to go together. And Imaginaries has done work on that. Bruno Latour was influenced by him when he was doing his different anthropological modes of the moderns. So I see a lot of synergies between those relational approaches and what we might call indigenous refusal. But so that just means that public good, I mean, the public and the custom divisions have to be problematized. But once it was understood multiply and mobile, then I guess what's the point in using words like public and good if you follow the approach to its logical conclusion? There's just too much going on all the time.
Just really briefly to add, like, what you made me think of is the ways in which a lot of Indigenous nations organize themselves politically, and including for knowledge, like the governance of knowledge as well as just governance of land and economics and whatnot. And many, though not all, do not have a centralized governing system where knowledge and power is always centralized. It's always shared amongst clans or houses, lands. And so this decentralization, I think in my mind, challenges some of the notion of the public good, because there's kind of a federalism that's happening. There's federalism that's happening within nation, and then there's a federalism that's happening between nations that there's boundaries. And if we use the word boundary as another way of saying refusal here, I think that this thinks about public good in certain ways, in the sense of like, does the knowledge that works well for one nation automatically, or should it automatically be transferred elsewhere? Maybe technology is one of those things that moves so quickly between cultures and peoples. But that's just what made me think of it. It made me pull your comment makes me think a little bit more broadly about what is the nature of Indigenous societies, that they're not politically bound in the same way that a state is, right? Like there's the state, the border between Canada and the US doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of Indigenous nations because the territories overlap that. So that doesn't really make sense in the sense of the ideas of the laws that fill up what happens in the United States boundary and the Canadian boundary doesn't necessarily make sense within, say, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe political systems that don't automatically bleed over to other spaces just because there are humans in those spaces. There's a negotiation or a treaty that happens between those spaces that certain things are shared and certain are not. So it doesn't really drill down exactly what you're talking about in the way that David, I think, really responded, but that's what your question made me think of, in the sense of like, well, what is the public? I don't think it's as expansive in at least Anishinaabe thought and the way that it's in the status thought.
Have you come across Eduardo Vivera de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics? So that's a very clear drawing upon Latin American indigenous approaches and using material semiotic approach in the world, and it's he sort of calls it like many worlds instead of many cultures. But so there is a lot of crossover for a while.
Can you repeat that?
I think his name's Eduardo Vivera de Castro, but the book is definitely Cannibal Metaphysics, but he's done other work with Dr Damien Lee as well on like the end of the world.
Very quick follow-up. So just in relation to Vivera de Castro's work, because I know that, David, you has, in a sense, like critiqued from a certain point about, how to say, and I remember that he wrote in the book about how, like, certain kind of indigenous heuristic can be reworked or can be hatched onto kind of Deleuzian or more like Western thoughts. Yeah, I just wonder if if you would like to expand more on that point. Sorry.
So yeah, that's what he sort of says. It's a sort of Deleuzian understanding of becoming, and I guess relational ontology. Everything is, the action is in the virtual, in the relationality, and then the appearances of the world are just thrown off. they're just on the surface. So modernity just works on the surface in that very limited and reductionist approach to the world, whereas relational understandings are understood to be much more encompassing, much more lively. So yeah, I recommend it's only a little book, Cannibal Metaphysics. So tell our seconds clocked.
I think we have some questions in the chat. So we have two questions in the chat. I'll just read them together. One is from Shiku. The question is, what indigenous and/or decolonial methodologies have you used or found useful in your work with indigenous communities? I'm looking at traditional ecological knowledges in my PhD. And another one, also from Caroline, is if there is a political desire also there, does that bring along the problematic of trying to rationally deal with a cannibal? I think she means what Damien mentioned in his presentation.
What's you?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, methodologies. Yeah. Let me start by saying that a really critical thing that I do in terms of research, so qualitative research, is reposition myself as not a researcher, I guess, but more importantly, I think the power that this place gives us, like the credentialism that, and the kind of the power that the academy or your degree gives you on the surface as the arbiter of what should happen in research, the one who makes decisions about what method should be used, or the one who makes decisions about the questions that are asked. I challenge that. I try to undermine that, because from Indigenous thought, specifically Anishinaabe thought, if you are the one doing the research, you're the one looking for knowledge. So how could you be the one who governs knowledge at the same time? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I approach research when I'm working with communities, whether they be elders, younger folks, men, women, hunters, fishermen, whatever the case may be. I reposition them as not participants or informants, as the kind of classical, administrative structure likes us to use, but as knowledge holders. And so there's a woman named Margaret Kovash who's written quite a bit about this, and others as well, Leanne Simpson, as well as Linda Smith, of course. But just drawing on Margaret Kovacs for a second, she really does make the space for your informants, quote unquote, to be the leaders of research, right? So when I go to a community and I'm in relationship with them and I'm doing a project with them, I will have some guiding questions prepared for the method of interview, although it's not even an interview, it's more of a conversation. And what happens in that space is that even though I'm there for a specific reason, let's just say it's citizenship, or let's say it's fisheries governance, I'm in that space with an agenda, I'm there to talk about a specific thing. I have some prompting questions prepared just in case we get off course. But really what's happening in that space is I hand over control to the people I'm speaking with, right? I'm here to talk to you about fishing. Why did you invite me to your house to talk about fishing? And then we spend 2 or 3 hours having the conversation go where it's going to go. That puts them in the leadership position to take the conversation where it needs to go, and really importantly, to assess whether or not they trust me enough to share, again, the most important parts, right? Coming back to refusal. they are the ones that decide if I'm ready to hear what they maybe are holding. So this is a political response to this question. It's we're talking about methodology here, but methodology shows up in different ways. It's about entrance, it's about maintaining a relationship, and it's about really being conscious to do a couple different things, but I'll just name here two of them. Being conscious to question the power of the academy in Indigenous space, and the academy being me in that moment, even if it's my own community. Like I'm the insider outsider in that moment. That's one thing that's happening. And another thing that's happening is also avoiding pitfalls around authenticity and what counts as authentic knowledge. Like what counts as authentic, Anishinaabe knowledge. Because if I'm too overbearing in the questions I prepare beforehand, I could corner someone through producing a distortion because that's maybe what they think I want to hear, right? So avoiding pitfalls of authenticity and distortion, and then getting to things like congruency and complexity, and avoiding binary, maybe, but just as an example, maybe part of what that looks like is saying I don't know how to speak my language, but I do fishing. And I use all these techniques that, may be seen by some as really I'm not colonial, you're Western. But I also at the same time maintain a relationship with the land and the fish. That is really important. And that's where the congruency comes. We could talk endlessly about this piece. But just to give you a little bit to that question, and just to respond to that, methodology is about, for me, it's about seeing and managing the power dynamic in the space, and then opening the conversations in such a way that it's really driven by the knowledge holders, because in that space I'm the knowledge seeker, then my job is to put it all together. And methodologically, there's a second point where you come back to them and say, did I get this right? Right? You have the power again to correct the transcript or delete the transcript or change it or whatever, so that you're always in control, because it's the power piece, right? Did you want to add? And then with the second question, the cannibal, the cannibal, engagement with the cannibal, I think that this is really situated in the Canadian context, so I apologize if it doesn't translate elsewhere, but many, although not all, right, Indigenous nations in Canada do have treaties with the Crown. And again, many, though not all, do want to uphold those treaties. And so that creates a tension around the cannibal, in the sense that, can you convert the cannibal into the non-cannibal? There's a lot of stories that speak about killing cannibals as the only way to solve this problem. That's the truth. That's what many of the stories say. I don't know what that means for us as researchers. I would say, though, that as far as treaties exist and are invested in, there is maybe something interesting for your the conversation we had earlier, David, is I think there maybe is a bit of a hope there that the cannibal will stop eating, but that gets us into weird territory.
So I think Caroline's question is, do Indigenous communities rationally deal with the cannibal, or are they dealing relationally?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the point might be that relationality is rational and coloniality is not rational. And there isn't a contradiction between having a sort of relational ontology, relational approach, and dealing with coloniality. I don't know, I'd like to press you maybe more on that, but maybe the question implies, can you do two different types of politics? The war politics and love politics. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think this is an interesting space. There's complexities that help us think through it a bit, in not all cases, but there are a lot of mixed families too, in the sense of there are relations, familial kinship relations between Indigenous communities and the settler society that, again, this is not for every community, but it's definitely not black and white. But I think in terms of like how we, to your point there about relationality, I think it's an interesting space in the sense like how are Indigenous communities, whether research or else otherwise, engaging with, if it's a cannibal, in ways that maintain a drive towards a futurity that is set on their terms. One of the things I'm pondering about all this is that in that space, I think that there is, I guess there's two things. There's the point of like potentially wanting to hold this other society to account in engaging, because like you can't avoid engaging, I think. And the other piece is that colonialism is again, we know, as we've said here, not black and white, but it also does influence Indigenous peoples to some degree, some more than others, to buy into the cannibal behavior. Like, so in Anishinaabe thought, the word for colonialism is not colonialism, and it's not whiteness. It's Jaganashiabasi, which means to live your life like a colonialist, right? So in that sense, the colonialism or the cannibal, kind of like the spirit of that thing, can influence your behavior and your thinking internally as well. So I think that there's like some really interesting kind of like ways to think about this that'll sum up in this way is like, who is the cannibal, right? I think that the settler society is where the cannibal spirit is coming from, but it's not just simply outside the community. It can at times, you can have people inside the community who are really invested in, say, extracting oil to the max or to get every single dollar possible. So it's not really a clear answer, but it's forcing me to think in some interesting ways about this. So thanks for that question and follow up. Yeah.
Wow. So
Question.
like
3 questions.
maybe if you guys don't, so well, we're set to like wrap up at 6, but I think we can do with the questions.
Maybe everyone could ask questions and we could wrap up.
Yeah. I'll just do the questions in the chat together. So one from Shiku is not really a question, it's just I think Damien mentioned one scholar like Margaret or something. I think like maybe they want the reference. And yeah. So,
Yeah. Someone else?
The person just left.
just like
I'm on at the back as well.
Okay. So my thought was about stopping. Damien mentioned, I forget the name of the author, but they said it's about knowing when to stop the refusal. And the way David has been talking, it sounds like relationality is a dynamic process, like it's in movement. So it makes me wonder if stopping is possible at all. And if it is, what does that look like? And if it isn't, then what comes next, both pragmatically, if someone refuses to share a story with you, and then also philosophically, like what movement happens if we can't stop.
Yeah.
Which one asked first, or should I?
No, go on.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much both. I just want to come back to this point of epistemic violence and sort of relationship between Western sciences and English knowledge or practices. Again, as I was working sort of translation setting from an archaeological background, and in that entire literature, in my field of experience as well, a lot of the practices of sort of integrating English knowledge into Western science, conservation science, and sort of synergizing as well, usually end up, as both of you have said, really appropriating English knowledge, or even justifying the Western science by merely mentioning English knowledge, or sometimes validating from the Western perspective. And then when talking about epistemic violence in these terms, I think we're still seeing the Western or Western trained rational science-minded being this epistemic incapacitor concurror again, whereas we're talking about refusal, but from the indigenous perspective, as the indigenous or non-Western knowledge system are always being this in a position to refuse almost passively. So this sort of brings me to think whether refusal is a very well, the most appropriate term to talk about here, or the most sort of productive one in what we're talking about academic leveling and bringing up different worldview and knowledge systems, and which again brought me to think about what Ngugi wa Thiong'o was talking about, the provincializing Europe and deprovincializing Africa in his study, and whether thinking about provincializing European knowledge and Western science as what's local and what's indigenous to the very specific setting of Europe, and with English scholar taking a more active role of fronting different knowledge systems to build relationship with other knowledge systems. A lot of these things are shared among many different ways in the world in the global majority environments. I'm not sure what your thought on this.
Yeah, just maybe take that 3.
Yeah, thank you both for very interesting presentations and discussion. My question was, I wanted to hear a little more on the topic that I think Damien already mentioned a little bit about earlier, but it's about if refusal is a useful framework for us to better understand early colonial relationships, and can we make it work there, or is it irresponsible in some ways? Thank you.
Sorry, I think the battery's dead on this mic. So maybe I'll respond to the first 2, and if you want to respond to this, is that make sense? Okay. Just really quickly, I just want to start with the last question. I mean, because I think it's probably politically the most important piece of this. Like in the last few minutes for me is that we have to be careful not to what James Blount called telescope history, like take what the frameworks we have now and make them make sense in the past, because that just distorts things, obviously. And so, no, I think refusal does damage if we apply it too far back. I think that there is a type of refusal that's happening in the kind of like early contact period that maybe has different productive kind of political elements at play that we don't want to lose sight of. I think the point that I want to make here right now, this is kind of this is like something that I'm trying to intervene with in Indigenous studies generally. It's like something that I'm politically concerned about outside of today's conversation. Is like, I think Indigenous studies as a discipline doesn't do enough work to do the thing of seeing the response to colonialism as a deeply rooted pre-colonial kind of like political system that it doesn't just emerge from colonialism. I think it adapts and it gets reapplied in different ways to the colonial era. But I think we do a big disservice to Indigenous nationhood and Indigenous legal systems and intellectual systems if we only assume that the thing of we can call it refusal, but I think it's a way of like hiding things or pivoting or even disassembling knowledges if we assume that only starts with colonialism. I think that predates colonialism. Now we're talking about refusal today and maybe fits in there a little bit, but the point I'm trying to make there is that we have to do better to see past the colonial order as the start of everything, because that just, again, reproduces the colonial framework, right? There's more to say in that. I just really quickly to the first question there about, so it's Dr. Audra Simpson that is writing about like when to stop. Interesting, the thing about her there is that she's writing about that as an insider outsider, like she's Mohawk doing research in her own community where the stuff pops up. But there's a piece to this, to your question about when to stop and what does it look like to stop and what does it mean to stop, that I think a lot of non-Indigenous researchers don't detect in this space. which is that silence is the no. So if you're trying to work with a community and you're getting no response, the silence is actually them saying actively, no, we don't want to do this. The reason I think that a lot of Canadian researchers, for example, don't get this is because there's almost like a valorization of being tenacious, right? Or of not giving up. And I'm just gonna be the one who kind of fights through it and gets to the goal or whatever. Like that whole thing, that's not really what's happening here. Like, so it's almost like a cultural misunderstanding that's happening, not with you, but like in general. So like sometimes just like what does it mean to stop, right? Sometimes stopping means you have to figure out a new project, but also sometimes stopping is signaled to you by just like no one's getting back to you. Like I sent 10 emails and no one responding. Well, that's your answer, right? Not yours, but just in general, like that's part of the politic here.
Thanks. So I guess you can have stopping and continuing in like a Marilyn Strathern and partial connection. But relationality doesn't mean everything is always related all the time. So some relations might thrive and some might, as Deborah Bird Rose, they might sort of death-like, So just because it's a relational ontology doesn't mean it's sort of affirmative, continually differentiating and growing. Relational ontologies like the stock market and the other relation can go up and down. But the epistemic violence question, so I'm not sure. I mean, just personally, it's difficult to have epistemic violence without ontological violence, and therefore, I think in our contemporary moment, we're less likely to go with provincializing Western knowledge because we understand that was bought at a certain cost, and it's not just provincialized into a part of the world. The world is already a product of Western modernity and settler coloniality. So I think that there's a difficulty of refusal, which we haven't really discussed. That how can you refuse the world? How can you refuse settler coloniality? It does refusal do the work, and well, what can do the work? Even if we take on like Edouard Glissant's sort of right to opacity. So I think the refusal, the right to opacity, the trying to draw a line to settler coloniality is a pretty defensive survival mode of engagement. And that can't be a solution to anyone as far as I can see. So what comes after refusal, if anything? That's to me is an open question. Maybe we discuss it in the bar afterwards. I don't know.
I was going to push a bit on after refusal, but I think it's already we've already passed this, so we're just gonna quickly wrap up and we'll bring the conversation to the common room. I think we kind of ended on a perfect note after refusal. That's a great starting point, another new starting point, another new panel, and just everyone, just please join me for a round of applause for our speakers for this like great conversation and for everyone who like made this conversation possible. Like, a little bit more like promotion. So we also have like a series of upcoming events and seminars. So the one that's upcoming next week or next month is on Indigenous heritage and climate activism. So there's going to be 3 kind of geographical focus on Siberia, on South America and Africa. So if you want to like get to know more about our events, please subscribe to our subscribe to our mailing list. Yeah, and just thanks everybody. Oh, we also got our like printed posters. We also yeah. our town card, and we also like always open for new members. And that's it. Thanks everyone, and have a great weekend.